Chapter 16 of The Girls of Friendly Terrace by Harriet Lummis Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. A Belated Invitation. Priscilla's curiosity grew overnight. When she waked Saturday morning, she found herself unable to think of anything but the singular episode of the preceding afternoon. She recalled the absorbed faces of the women who had watched Elaine, the suppressed eagerness of their triumph when she turned about, and lastly Elaine's incomprehensible panic over finding herself observed. Priscilla racked her brains for a possible explanation, but her imagination was unequal to suggesting any that was credible to Peggy's next-door neighbor. It was not long after breakfast when she presented herself at Peggy's door in the hopes that Peggy might be able to throw light on the situation. Peggy was doing the chamber work on the second floor, and Priscilla was glad to assist in the ceremony of bed-making because of the opportunity this afforded for an uninterrupted discussion of the mystery. "I want to talk to you about yesterday," she said in the carefully lowered voice which seemed appropriate to the situation, though, as a matter of fact, she might have shouted without attracting anybody's attention. "I've thought about it all night." "Me too," Peggy's tone was enthusiastic, "especially that andante movement." "Oh, Peggy!" Priscilla twitched a sheet with an energy that pulled it away from the foot of the mattress and sent Peggy hurrying to repair damages. "What nonsense! As though I was thinking of andante movements or any other kind. I mean about Elaine. Wasn't it nice to see how she enjoyed it? She really knows a lot about music, and the more you know, the better you appreciate it, especially classical music." Peggy was clearly talking against time, advancing her by no means original views with an earnestness which was far beyond their deserts. Priscilla was conscious of a feeling of irritation. She did seem to enjoy the music, I'll admit, but apparently she doesn't enjoy meeting old acquaintances. Quite the opposite. "She didn't meet any old acquaintances," said Peggy quietly. "Those women thought they knew her, even before she turned around, and after that they were sure. They might have been mistaken for all that." Peggy smoothed the comforter anxiously, as if to have it lie without a wrinkle was the most important matter under consideration. If they were mistaken, why did Elaine run? The suspicious thing was her being frightened to death the minute she found anybody noticing her. If she hadn't done anything to be ashamed of. Peggy felt the time had come to discard the policy of evasion. She straightened herself, looking across the billowing bedclothes, straight into her friend's eyes. Elaine hasn't any reason to be ashamed of anything she has done. What is the matter, then? "There's nothing I can tell, Priscilla." "Nothing you will, you mean. If you know about it, it wouldn't be any more than friendly to explain." "There's nothing I can tell," repeated Peggy firmly. Priscilla found the reiteration irritating. "I suppose she's confided everything to you, and expects that we'll take your word for her. Well, I won't, for one. We don't know anything about her, except that she can be mighty disagreeable when she tries, and yesterday capped the climax. I shan't have anything more to do with her till I know what it all meant." "That's for you to decide." Peggy's tone was decidedly cool. Her hands trembled as she twitched the coverlets into place. The intensity of her sympathy, kindled by Elaine's pitiful story, perhaps rendered her incapable of doing full justice to Priscilla. Unfortunately, her manner fired the jealous resentment which was Priscilla's greatest weakness. "Of course, if you're going to take sides with her, Peggy Raymond, against your best friends, if you're going to throw me over just because—" "How silly!" snapped Peggy. "Oh, please, Priscilla, don't pull those bedclothes up from the foot again." Priscilla's face was white. "I see I'm in the way. That girl has spoiled our friendship. You've never been the same, Peggy, since Elaine Marshall moved to Friendly Terrace." "How silly!" exploded Peggy, angered by the injustice of the charge and momentarily abandoning her usual tactful methods. "As if anybody but our two selves could spoil our friendship." She watched Priscilla's dignified withdrawal without protest. She was tired of these scenes, she told herself. It was time Priscilla had a good lesson. She punched a pillow into place with a vehemence implying that she held it solely responsible for all that had occurred. As for Priscilla, she closed the door behind her, with the feeling that she had burned her bridges and that no retreat was possible. All was over. She had been very fond of Peggy, but Peggy's fashion of losing her head over every new girl who came to the terrace was bound to grow tiresome. Peggy had clearly indicated on which side her sympathies lay. She had chosen Elaine in preference to the friend of many years' standing. By the time Priscilla was at her own door, she was ready to believe that she had been most unfairly treated. Priscilla was not the sort of girl to rest quietly under a grievance. Her first impulse was to assert herself, to prove to all observers how little she cared. Accordingly, she burst in upon her mother with the request, "May I have some of the girls to luncheon next Saturday, Mother? I don't mean 2 or 3. I'd like a dozen or so, a real party." "Let me see." Mrs. Combs was accustomed to these impulsive outbreaks on Priscilla's part. "What day is Saturday?" "The 13th. I have an invitation to luncheon myself for that day. Still, you could manage without me, I dare say." "Oh, yes. I don't want anything elaborate, only nice, you know, and Susan's cousin can come to wait on the table. She does it very nicely and doesn't charge much of anything." Priscilla hurried to her writing desk and pulled out her notepaper. A party without Peggy. Could there be a better way of asserting herself and proving how little she was moved by the loss of Peggy's friendship? She dashed off the invitations as hastily as if she were afraid to give herself time for reflection. Peggy was not long in hearing of Priscilla's luncheon party, and the non-appearance of her invitation was a secret she kept to herself. That she was hurt goes without saying. The 2 girls had been friends for years, and up to this time Peggy's ground of complaint had been the excess of the other's affection, rather than any lack. It was hard to believe that Priscilla was planning so pronounced a slight. She tried to make herself believe that there was some mistake, but the passing days brought the conviction that the omission was deliberate, and that the chief purpose of the little festivity was her open humiliation. This would have been bad enough, but to make matters worse, Peggy's conscience took a hand. An uncompromising monitor was this same conscience, sternly denying Peggy the luxury of self-pity, and arraigning her in a fashion little short of merciless. Ardently it pleaded Priscilla's cause. Her suspicions of Elaine were not without foundation. Peggy herself might have shared them, had it not been for the extraordinary story to which she had listened. In any case, she had failed to show the patience due one friend from another. She who prided herself on her tact had been brusque and tactless. Knowing poor Priscilla's weakness, she had not been on her guard. She had lost her friend, and for her comfort had the reflection that it was, in part at least, her own fault. It was a blue week for Peggy, and hardly better for Priscilla. She studied cookbooks, planned out her menu, and tried to think that her low spirits were due to dreadful doubts as to Susan's salad dressing, while all the time she knew that she missed Peggy. She wanted to ask her opinion as to whether to order the ices from Bird's or Connolly's, and to consult her about the place cards. How loyally Peggy would have counseled and lent her aid. Many a time she had helped some distracted hostess till she had barely time to fly home and change her dress before the appointed hour. Saturday was cloudless, a fact which Priscilla came near resenting. Gray skies and a drizzle of rain would have harmonized better with her mood. Mrs. Combs was puzzled by the overcast face her daughter brought down to breakfast. "What is it, child? Anything wrong with your plans?" "No, I guess everything's all right," Priscilla responded in the most doleful of voices. "A pleasant hostess is the chief factor in making pleasant guests. I advise smoothing a few of those wrinkles out of your forehead when you attend to the rest of your toilet," advised Mrs. Combs smilingly, and she was more puzzled than ever when Priscilla received her counsel with a sigh. The luncheon hour was set for 1 o'clock, but at 12:30 the girls began to arrive, formality never being much in evidence on Friendly Terrace. "Wonder if Peggy's here yet," Ruth remarked, as she stood before Priscilla's mirror, giving her hair the little caressing pats whose importance every girl understands. "I don't believe Peggy is coming." It was Blanche Estabrook who made the remark, apparently without realizing its importance. Ruth and Amy whirled about. "Not coming?" they exclaimed in a breath. "She was on Elaine Marshall's back steps talking to her as I came by. She had on a blue gingham, and that didn't look very much like going out to luncheon." Blanche ran down the stairs, leaving Amy and Ruth gazing blankly at each other. "Now I think of it, I believe something has been wrong all week," Amy exclaimed. "Priscilla has kept to herself, hasn't she? I don't remember her walking home from school with Peggy." "I don't believe she has. To think of her not asking Peggy." Ruth gave a refractory lock a jerk, which threatened to undo, all in a moment, the result of much patient labor. "I really think I wouldn't have come myself if I'd known." Downstairs, the early arrivals were chatting gaily. Ruth and Amy descended together to join them, feeling little in the mood for festivity of any sort. "If it had been anybody but Peggy," Amy said angrily on the way down, and Ruth replied, Seems as if there must be some mistake, Amy. Perhaps she'll come after all. The doorbell rang several times before 1 o'clock, but no breathless Peggy appeared, apologizing for the delay and smiling on everybody. Ruth made no efforts to be entertaining, but sat watching the door and making absent replies to the girl who sat next her. Amy, too, was uneasy, and curious little lulls occurred in the conversation, a phenomenon almost unheard of when a group of girls are together. "Well, I believe we're all here," Priscilla announced at last. "Excuse me for a minute while I tell Susan." She rose and stepped into the hall. In an instant Amy had followed, closing the door behind her. "Priscilla!" Amy's excited tones were plainly audible in the room where the girls sat waiting, though not her words. "You don't mean that these girls are all the party?" "Certainly they are." Priscilla eyed her friend suspiciously. "But there are 13 of us. Do you think I'd sit down 13 at the table, and on the 13th of the month, too?" Amy was very much in earnest. Her plump, good-natured face was actually pale. "I tell you, I wouldn't think of such a thing." "I believe there are 13. Ray Fletcher couldn't come." Priscilla had recovered herself in a moment. "But that silly old superstition, Amy, you don't mean—" "Yes, I do mean it. And there's lots of other people who feel just the same about it." Amy suddenly opened the door of the front room. "Come here, Ruth. We want you a minute." Ruth made her appearance, expecting to be consulted on a very different matter. Amy's tragic explanation took her by surprise, and she smiled a little. "Oh, well," she was beginning, and then checked herself, as the possibility of turning Amy's superstitious terrors to good account flashed upon her. "I simply won't do it," Amy was insisting. "And on the 13th of the month especially. I wouldn't have another peaceful minute all the year. Ruth, why don't you say something?" "Why don't you ask somebody else and make 14? Ruth offered the suggestion nonchalantly, though her pulse had quickened. "There isn't anybody I can ask at the very last minute. Mother's gone to Mrs. "Why not ask Peggy?" Amy's excitement over the fatal number of Priscilla's guests had made her temporarily forgetful of her earlier reason for disquiet. At Ruth's master stroke she gasped with admiration, and promptly seconded the suggestion. "Oh, yes, ask Peggy. She's just the one." Priscilla stood with downcast eyes, and breathlessly her two friends awaited her answer. For a moment the outcome was uncertain. Priscilla was quite capable of resenting such advice, and earlier in the week would undoubtedly have done so. But if Peggy's conscience had been an uncomfortable companion, Priscilla's had not been less active, and her anticipated triumph in having a party without Peggy had proved bitter as Dead Sea fruit. When she spoke, her voice was tremulous, in spite of her efforts to make it sound indifferent. "Oh, I don't believe Peggy will come. We had a little misunderstanding, you see." "It wouldn't do any harm to try," suggested Ruth, still painstakingly matter-of-fact, while Amy added with less tact, "If anybody would do it, it's Peggy. She's the forgivingest thing." Peggy was at the dinner table, when there was an agitated knocking sound at the side door. A breathless voice in the hall made inquiries of Sally. "Somebody to see you, Miss Peggy," was Sally's grudging announcement. She disapproved of people who came at mealtime. To Peggy's amazement, it was Priscilla waiting in the hall. Priscilla in her best white frock, and with a pallor that was rather appealing. "I know you won't do it," was her opening remark. "Won't do what, Priscilla?" Peggy was to be pardoned if her manner was a little formal. "There are 13 of us, and Amy won't sit down at all, but it serves me right if my party's spoiled after treating you that way." Priscilla gulped. Peggy's manner became less dignified. "You mean that there's 13, and you want me for the 14th? Of course you won't come, but it serves me right to have you say no." Priscilla bit her lip to keep from crying. Peggy threw a hurried glance at the mirror. "Will my hair do? I've got to change my dress, of course." "You're going to do it?" Priscilla fairly screamed. "Oh, Peggy, you're an angel. You can't think how wretched I've been all the week and how ashamed. Oh, you darling, can you ever forgive me?" They rushed upstairs, their arms about each other's waists. "Don't make me cry," pleaded Peggy, gulping down a sob, "because I really mustn't take time to wash my face, you know. I'll wear my pink. I can get into that in a shake." It was only 15 minutes after the hour named on the invitations that Priscilla's guests sat down to a very dainty and highly successful luncheon. "Do you know, I thought you weren't coming," Blanche Estabrook said to Peggy as they took their seats. "I'm so sorry to be late and keep everybody waiting," Peggy answered with gentle regret. And that was all most of them knew about the belated invitation. But there was no doubt in the minds of any of the gay crowd that 14 was a peculiarly lucky number on any day of the month. End of chapter 16.